All of us who've dealt with governments for decades sometimes think it's a good thing governments are inefficient, because usually when they have a clear vision of what they want to do, they make things worse. So vision is fine, but it has to be founded on an understanding of the issues. And this is where we're stuck at the moment to explain. What I'm going to do is to start with an overview of why a systems perspective is essential at this stage to understand and to act on the issues which we face. We face huge risks which are coming at us much faster than we probably understand, and the impacts of the problems which are building up out there are very severe. So we don't have the luxury of decades to think about it. We have to come very rapidly to organize ourselves to do something. I will illustrate the role of systems thinking by looking at a number of concrete issues, rather than just talk in theoretical terms about systems thinking, which I'm doing later this week at the IASA. So here I will be more practical. And then I'm going to suggest, as requested, some key issues which might be of interest in formulating a future program for Academy. And then I'm going to say a few words about education, because education to me is a fundamental building block of whatever we do in resolving these problems. So let me start without apology in this remarkable group by making a couple of relatively academic points. First is that John Kenneth Galbraith, as you will remember, identified something called the conventional wisdom, which is what we basically works. And at different periods in our history, the conventional wisdom breaks down, so that the basic thinking we are working on does not explain what will happen if we try to do something. Eric Weil and Michael Oakeshott studied this question long before Galbraith and asked the question, what is a turning point in the history of ideas? And the question is, where are we now in this kind of broad academic perspective? And the short answer is that the past certainties are failing. Even market fundamentalism, which dominated in an aberration for more than 30 years, is now weak. It's not gone by any means. It's still very strong in certain places, but it has weakened. And the conclusion from that is that the conditions are now reunited to propose new ideas, because one precondition is the weakening of the arrogance of the established ideas. So we have big opportunity, and I see this as one important role for the Academy. So what then are the characteristics of the challenges we face in the 21st century? How far these are different from previous we can discuss. But what are the characteristics? Very briefly, telegraphically, the first is they're truly global. For many, many reasons, including information technologies and so on. We live in a world quite different from what it was like 30, 40, 50 years ago. The second, which people do not recognize properly, is the scale of the problems. There's an implicit notion in the heads of our leaders that if you have 9 billion people, it's just a bit bigger than having 7 billion, which is just a bit bigger than having 5 billion. Any scientist will tell you when you change the scale of something, you change its nature. And we are now living at a time of what is called the Anthropocene, where human impacts are now changing the planet more, or in many cases, than natural. We're also living at a time of very rapid dynamic change, which in terms of systems thinking tells you immediately that the rate of change has consequences quite apart from the amount of speed of change. To give you a swift example, IPCC calculated 10 years ago that if the temperature rises of 0.1 degree per decade, which it is, 15% of the affected species are at risk. That's not to do with the actual temperature, it's to do with the rate of change because they can't adapt. Anybody concerned with systems knows that the dynamic behavior of systems in effect is what it's all about. We all know, and we've heard this morning, that we're dealing with issues which are intensely interconnected. I don't have the time to go through all that, but that is a characteristic of this age. but we are organized to pretend that they aren't. When you say even the words UN specialized agency, you suddenly see the problem. A real development problem engages many facets. We are obliged to separate these out and decide how to intervene, as Alexander just said. Arising from all of this comes a fundamental point affecting the risks to the future of our civilization. Systems behave as they choose to behave, not as we think they should, and we are dealing with non-linear behavior of complex systems. I will talk about climate. You will discover that even the negotiators in Lima don't have a clue about the risks arising now from the non-linear behavior of the complex systems which constitute the climate. The last point I would make is that we are engaged in fundamental transformation of all the things we're talking about, and that implies we need a longer-term vision of where we're headed, which we don't have. If you look at the G20, every year they prepare some thoughtful, intelligent preparation, and every year they forget all about it under the pressure of immediate crises. Our leaders are struggling under the pressure of immediate problems and have very little time to look at the issues that we're talking about. That's where we are in terms of the issues. And effectively, I'd just say one point before moving on. We have, in fact, created a world of complexity, which is, at least at present, beyond our capacity. We like to think arrogantly as humans that we can manage everything. That's the basis of our whole approach, positivist, as you said. But maybe we can't. If so, we have to conclude very differently that our task is to reduce this complexity in order to make it manageable. I can't get into that now, but this is the kind of dilemma we face. We cannot simply assume, as humans, that by some miracle we can create something called global governance, put a chap at the top of the pyramid and manage this set of problems. They're too complicated. What we do about that, what that means, is beyond this quick introduction, but basically that's a crucial question. Effectively, the model is the sorcerer's apprentice of Goethe. We have created a problem, and there is at the moment no magician who's going to come in suddenly in the last reel and save us. So why are we failing to solve these problems? Very briefly again, we tackle these problems through sectoral interventions. We poke at the system through one sectoral intervention. We talk about silos, and the silos are so powerful that people in separate rooms don't talk to each other. We have a reductionist approach to science which separates everything out because we believe in the end we can integrate it again, which now is beginning to be clear that we can't. We tend to go for short-term immediate responses which are partial and disconnected and ad hoc, and then we're surprised that we cannot solve systemic problems. We have very limited capacity to convey the results of scientific analysis into the policy process. For all sorts of reasons. It's not simply that politicians are stupid. It's much more subtle than that. But that interface is failing completely. Climate change being the obvious example. Ecosystems the same. All over the world you see this problem that policymakers are working on one basis, whereas the science is telling us something completely different. Finally, we fail to understand the nature and behavior of what are effectively systems. We saw this in the financial crisis. It took months before the Americans recognized that this was not a local failure of Lehman Brothers or something in the United States, but a threat to the stability of the whole world financial system. And now they have acknowledged that, and they're implementing measures to try to control the systemic problem, but it's a bit late. So there is, as many speakers have said, an urgent need for new models and methods, and in the core of this has to be something called systems thinking. So let me now sketch some practical themes which may open up some further discussion. I start with economy and ecology because that's what I was asked to do. We should have no illusions. The world is still dominated and driven by economic and financial institutions, pressures, interests, and policies. Issues of inequality are viewed as second-order issues in the global decision-making apparatus. This is beginning to change, but it hasn't changed yet. But the economy is in fact a human artifact, and it is a subsystem of the real physical world. The way we hear about it and read about it is the economy is the real world, and now we must add something to deal with environmental problems. That's complete nonsense. The economy doesn't function without the physical world. And I'm happy to say that the Chinese now are beginning to focus exactly on that question. So we're now reaching the limits which we can push the physical world to, as the Club of Rome pointed out repeatedly, and as the Stockholm Resilience Institute with its work on boundaries has clearly shown. We know, as people have already said, that business as usual is leading us to disaster, but the projections for the future of the world economy remain today. A recent study by Citibank to 2060, drawing on many other sources, assumes a tripling of the size of the world economy. But they do have the grace to say, in making this assessment, we're ignoring these issues, and those are the issues which actually matter. The Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them with 169 sub-goals, are laudable objectives. But think about it. Nobody has proposed the mechanism by which they will be achieved. That's what we're working on now. We have only goals. Right? So we've had goals before. In 45 years in the system, I've seen lots of goals. The question is how. So how do we transform our current strategy to avert disaster? And here I'd pin down one very simple point. There are parallel debates going on across the world which don't intersect. They're beginning to, but until recently they didn't. Namely, the debate on the recovery from the financial crisis, the management of the world economy, the stimulus of demand to make the system work. And all these people talk to each other in the OECD, in the basement. They sit in one room, and in the next room you have people worrying about resources, environment, ecology, and climate. There's very little contact. It began to become serious with the report of President Calderon of Mexico on the new climate economy, which has proved that being responsible environmentally is a plus, not a minus for the economy. But we're still at a point where the power structure in most governments, and certainly at the international level, is dominated by economics, and we are still struggling to get our ideas into the debate. Therefore, a fundamental challenge for survival is to integrate these two debates. I'll say something about that in a minute. All right. This poses, in my analysis, which I don't have time to go into, 5 facets, 5 dimensions of this problem which have to be looked at. One is the intellectual issue, which we're talking about here. What are the models and paradigms where we can resolve this problem? The second is the moral challenge. We're talking about injustice across the world, huge problems of morality and ethics. Solidarity has disappeared from the international debate. So we're talking about a moral crisis which underpins most of the other issues we're talking about. We have a political or power crisis in that corporate and financial interests have taken over the role of government to a vast extent domestically, and if the TPP and TTIP go through, they will have got a big step further forward at the international level. We have an institutional crisis, and we have a social crisis. So these are the 5 dimensions of this whole area that we're talking about. And systems thinking is one way of thinking our way through that. So the first question of integrating economy and ecology is crucial, but it raises these much deeper problems which have to be assessed. And the fundamental question is, how do we achieve transformative change? Not simply what ought to be the goals of change, but how in hell do we achieve it? And we spend so little time on the how and all our time on the what. So I think that's something your academy may want to think about. So to move from that broad banalité about world problems, let me look at what China's been doing, because I've been working with them for 35 years on these questions. They have demonstrated that the transformation I've just described is eminently possible, and it is in fact happening. So we're not in a kind of romantic phase of talking about the need to change the world. It can be done. 20% of the world is doing it. And I'll go quickly through a few points and then move on. In the early phases of reform and opening up, which is what Deng Xiaoping called it in the late 70s, the growth was the holy grail. Why? Because growth meant employment, employment meant stability, and stability of the Communist Party. Therefore, growth was the most important thing. As I'll explain tomorrow, they organized this process around what they called the 4 modernizations, one of which was science and technology. And we're right back there now in China again today. They considered environmental damage and social inequality simply as inevitable costs of economic growth, just as the British did a couple of hundred years before in the Industrial Revolution. They moved from that perception of growth to the question of integration of growth and environment. And I happen to know very well one formula where they integrated the strategic thinking about economics and environment by creating the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. This brings together ministers and foreigners across disciplines and ministries, between national and international, between strategic and long-term, between science and research through working groups and top-level strategic policy, and between theory and practice. And it has been remarkably successful. It affected the 10th five-year plan, which brought together the environmental consequences of economic growth at the grassroots level across China. And it led, in part, only in part, of course, to the climate strategy of China, which is a remarkable document worth reading, which integrates the issues of climate with the wider issues of government. They set up a group in China called a leading group of 17 ministers, chaired by the Premier, and they gave the secretariat job to the National Development and Reform Commission. That is to say, they saw climate as a strategic issue for the whole government, not as a standalone environmental issue to be given to the Minister of Environment. They are now confronted by a challenge to innovate their whole economy, to change the path of their economy, partly because of demographics and aging society, partly because of changes in competitivity and productivity, and they are trying now in the 13th five-year plan to reorient their economy onto a completely different basis and to resolve problems at the same time. So there's a very interesting debate going on in China. I'll tell you an interesting thing just to make this real. I was there in '83 at one point at a meeting, and they showed for the first time the consequences of the Cultural Revolution for education. And they showed the number of doctoral students in China pre-Cultural Revolution. I don't remember the figure, probably 500. And then suddenly the graph went zoom like that to 0. And for 10 years, roughly, there were no doctoral students in China. Now, I read just the other day, they've got 30,000 doctoral students a year, right? So you can see how China is putting an emphasis on education. Final point about China, next year they chair the G20. And they have put climate on the agenda of the G20. Now they're wondering why they did that. And the question is, can we get, through the Chinese leadership, the G20 to begin to integrate the economics and environment together? That's another story. All right. To me, the climate issue is so urgent that all the general talk about future trends and future possibilities don't solve the climate problem. So systems thinking is vital, even to understand the climate problem, and notably to assess the risks that we are running by behaving as we do. Climate is not an environmental issue that has to be said again and again. The symptoms of climate change are environmental, the causes are not. They lie in our economies and our societies and our behavior. If we do not address the drivers of climate, we're not going to solve the problem, which is why ministers of environment have talked for 20 years about it and got nowhere. We now hope in Paris there may be a change in that. Climate is therefore linked crucially to demography, although people don't wish to say that. If the world stabilizes at 8.5 billion, or rather than 9.5 or 10 billion, that is the cheapest way of cutting emissions. That's a known fact. And this can be done humanely and correctly and brings many co-benefits for development, poverty reduction, education of women and so forth. So that's a perfectly feasible strategy, largely ignored, certainly, in the COPs. The terrestrial and ocean ecosystems of the planet absorb 50% of our emissions. If we therefore destroy our ecosystems, we are aggravating the problem of the concentration of greenhouse gases. So climate and ecology are almost the same problem.